So I want to welcome everyone who's come online for our NRB Live at Lunch. This is a special seminar on platform censorship and big tech that I know everyone is interested in. We're going to get started here in a few minutes. I want to give a chance for everyone to kind of get in, get settled a little bit, but glad to have all of you here. And this is a great day to host this conversation because of some of the things in the news that we'll be discussing, but probably wait a couple more minutes here before we get started. But grateful for everyone to be part of this, and these are ongoing discussions that NRB is wanting to host and to have, and want to remind everyone too, if you haven't, you should register for our NRB convention in June in Texas, June 21st to 24th. It's in Dallas, Texas. And we're going to be having a conversation there as well on this that features a couple of our guests from today. So you'll want to do that. All right, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. So I want to welcome everyone to NRB Live at Lunch, and grateful that you've joined us today. We've enjoyed having these conversations about once or twice a month on a variety of topics of concern and interest to anyone working in Christian media. Just a reminder, if you don't know who NRB is, we're the National Religious Broadcasters. We're an association of Christian communicators. So anyone involved in Christian communication, from radio and television to digital and film, anyone that creates content in any way, as well as a lot of folks who do advocacy work. We're an organization that is trying to equip those who are in Christian media, but also to advocate on behalf of Christian media, both in keeping the airwaves free and open for the gospel, but also increasingly keeping the platforms open and free for our ministries to do the work that God has called them to do. I'm excited about this edition of NRB Live at Lunch because we're talking about censorship and big tech, and I have several distinguished guests with me that I'm glad to have. First, we have Craig DeRoche, who is president and CEO of the Family Policy Council, which was formed and created by Focus on the Family and does great work on the legislative front in all of our states. And I believe they have about 40 affiliates. And Craig, you can explain more about that in a little bit here. We have Jason Thacker, who is the chair of Research and Technology Ethics at the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, also the author of an important book called The Age of AI, just helping us think through technology and ethics in this digital age. He's pretty widely read and quoted, has a really great podcast called Weekly Tech that I encourage you to sign up for and listen to. And then, of course, Ryan Anderson, who's the CEO of the Ethics and Public Policy Center, previously from the Heritage Foundation. Ryan is obviously well versed and well known on a lot of these issues. So I want to start my first question, just get it out of the way right away. The elephant in the room is today the Facebook Oversight Board issued a ruling on the ban that Facebook had put on President Trump's use of Facebook. Kind of an interesting ruling, and I'd love for each of you to kind of weigh in on there. And I know there's probably going to be a diversity of opinions on whether they did the right thing, how they should proceed going forward. But it seems like a kind of an interesting ruling from the sense of they sort of punted it back to Facebook and rebuked Facebook a little bit, but then again upheld the ban. So I want to start with you, Craig, if you have any thoughts on it initially as you're reading through this and what you're thinking on this going forward.
Well, thank you. And I have a lot of thoughts, and it is complicated when you go into that. And it shouldn't have happened. I think it speaks very poorly of Facebook and their processes. I think it shows a lack of interest in a diversity of opinion and what's going on in our community. It's not a small fraction of our society that wants to have these conversations in social media as what it's become through groups and forums and messages and all these other things. And I don't personally use Facebook for that. I use it for family announcements. I've got a daughter graduating from high school, but a big part of it is political discourse, and that's their business model, and that's where they get their advertising revenue. in. And so I think we should all be greatly concerned about the notion that in a free country with this service, that they should do this. And I take interest in what Justice Thomas wrote, that we could treat them like utilities. And that makes me nervous too. I understand that that could be a fix, but at the same time, I was a former Speaker of the House in Michigan, and I saw how regulations of utilities help preserve and prevent competition, preserve the old models of telephone and cable television and things like that from entry. And so if, it might actually forestall Facebook going the way of MySpace or something like that in the future if they were protected as a utility. So it's a complicated issue, but I think it's a gargantuan mistake, and it should be eye-opening to Americans of what this is. In the documentary about social media, they said if you're not paying for the service, you're the product. And I think that they're just letting us know what they think of us that they're further trying to manipulate the people that are their members of their free service at Facebook.
So that's an interesting perspective, Craig, and I think you echo probably what a lot of folks are thinking as they're reading this decision. Jason, I want to ask you a little bit. You have an interesting perspective in that you have actually been working and talking in conversation with some of these platforms, particularly Facebook, and particularly the oversight board, which is interesting to me that they've included a lot of conservative voices on the board in here, but it seems like kind of a complicated decision that they made. So maybe kind of explain some of the conversations you've had and your perspective.
Yeah, and I'll echo what Craig said. These are very complicated situations. I think often when we look at the conversation and a lot of the debates and controversies surrounding the technology industry in general, there's a lot of things that we can easily kind of latch things onto, whether it's Section 230, that's a buzzword to say we must repeal or reform 230. We have issues of big tech censorship. We have issues of the board and the decisions it's making and conservative and political bias. And so I think it's specifically with this decision, it was really interesting to me because if you go to read the actual decision, not reading stories about it or tweets about the story, but actually go back and read the decision, it's a fairly nuanced decision. And this kind of speaks to the validity of the board. In some sense, in my mind, because over the last few years, I've had the privilege and honor to be part of the conversations with Facebook and then with the oversight board as it became an independent entity from Facebook, talking about the nature of the board, the way it should be set up, and been one of the lone conservatives in the room. It's in a group of 40 or 50 different influential leaders in the tech space and censorship and law and technology. To be one of the lone conservatives in the room actually saying, hey, the way we're going about this is not okay. I think a lot of times, a lot of the frustrations that our communities feel, especially people of faith, is that these policies, these community standards that these companies have are often ill-defined. They're often overly broad, and they often can lump especially religious speech under the banner of hate speech. And I think we're seeing that in Ryan Anderson's book being removed from Amazon. We're seeing that in issues with Focus on the Family and Daily Citizen's account being locked in terms of issues of transgender and misgendering or dead naming. A lot of these policies, as I work with these companies to say, look, these are incredibly ill-defined and you're going beyond the standard that even the United States government or kind of popular conceptions of what constitutes hate speech or incitement of violence and things. And these are extremely complicated, but the decision here is really interesting because you can read this as Facebook kind of punted the decision to the oversight board to make the call to do what Facebook didn't want to do or wasn't able or willing to do at the time, which is identify exactly what former President Trump did and why they instituted an indefinite ban. And that indefiniteness of that ban is the exact reason that the Facebook oversight board has punted this back over to Facebook to say you have to define exactly what happened. And you have to say exactly why this ban was indefinite. You can't say it's indefinite. You broke your own policies. And that's essentially what the board is saying. You broke your own policies by not doing one of the three options, which was remove the violating content. you could lock the account for a period of time, or you could permanently ban and disable the account. Facebook did not choose one of the three remedies in their own policies. And so the board is saying, Facebook, you are inconsistent in the way that you went about this suspension of President Trump, making it an indefinite ban. And so now the board has recommended and told Facebook they have 6 months to come up with the exact reason and decision on if they're going to permanently ban the president from the platform, Instagram and Facebook primarily, or if they're going to reinstitute it and what that looks like.
Ryan, I want to go to you. I'm curious your perspective on this. I'm going to probably come back around to each of you and talk about specific cases, particularly Ryan, your case with Amazon, and Craig with Focus on the Family. But before that, Ryan, I would just like to get your perspective on the kind of Facebook Trump situation and kind of your perspective.
Sure. I mean, so I don't have too much to offer because I haven't actually, read the oversight board's decision. I've been in like back-to-back meetings and things this morning. And so I can't comment beyond this. In between, meetings, I saw that Jake Tapper had tweeted something out about how curious it is that all of a sudden when politicians don't like the action of a private business, they now think that government should do something about it. And it just strikes me that is not curious at all, right? I mean, we have all sorts of regulations on businesses, and the left does this all the time, right? We shouldn't be naive about how, especially during the past 50 to 100 years, the left has passed countless laws that regulate the behavior of businesses, and not only big businesses, right? And so we've seen this kind of in our particular space, most recently on some of the, Baker florist photographers, right? And so I tweeted something back to him saying, but wait a minute, like you weren't saying this when, the Baker florist photographer was in court, and they don't have the market power that a Facebook has. They are engaged in their own speech when they create the custom cake or when they arrange the wedding flowers. It's their artistic creation. It's a celebratory event. I mean, so there are all sorts of complicating factors. And yet you didn't hear any voices on the left saying that Jack Phillips or Barronelle Stutzman should be free to run their business in accordance with their beliefs. And so I mean, I think there's something a little too precious when you see voices on the left saying how strange it is that all of a sudden politicians are, interested in what the law should be when businesses do things that might be harmful to the common good, right? And I think that's, to my mind, something that's been salutary about the past several years in the way that conservatives have thought about this. And by this, I just mean, what should the government posture be vis-a-vis business, is that it's one that's not just going to be kind of uncritical laissez-faire. That, laissez-faire makes sense in certain contexts, but it's not an absolute value. And that the political common good is going to be multifaceted. Liberty is going to be part of it, but it's not the only thing that's part of it. There's substantive ends, substantive goods that we're concerned about. And therefore, as both Craig and Jason said, these are complicated issues. There aren't easy answers. And so you can't kind of have a pat response or ready-made solution of either private businesses can do whatever they want because free market, or government should just directly impose, my values because they're my values and I'm in power, right? Between those two extremes, there's going to be a lot of nuance and a lot of, I think, new thinking that needs to take place, right? In a way that I think some people, particularly on the political right, haven't been exercising those muscles in their brains to think about, how do we enact policy and law that would help regulate markets to achieve the purpose of the markets, right? Which is justice, the common good, human flourishing. Markets don't exist for their own sake, right? Markets are tools to serve certain ends. That said, again, I haven't looked into the Facebook thing besides, commentary on social media. And, I think I take Jason's counsel seriously. We said we should actually read these things. We should, before we comment on them, we should actually look at what they said and why they said it. Yeah, so that's all I'll probably say about the Facebook Trump situation.
So Ryan, I want to stay with you because I want to kind of go around the horn a little bit and talk about some specific cases of censorship. And obviously yours probably rises to the top in terms of the attention it's received, but obviously Amazon pulling your book, and just maybe explain, I think we all understand that they pulled your book and several other places did, but maybe explain maybe what people may not understand in terms of behind the scenes and how you try to work with them and contact them and what that experience has been like for you, and kind of what you've thought through that experience. And by the way, while you're talking, I'm going to put the link to buying your book.
Barnes and Nobles or directly from the publisher or something like that.
So that while people are listening to you, they can actually have access to it. I'll put that in the chat here, but I'd love for you to share your thoughts on how that experience is.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I mean, I appreciate the chance to say a little bit of this, because I mean, I intentionally wrote a book with the thought that it wouldn't be deplatformed, censored, banned, because it wasn't like a bomb throwing red meat, et cetera, right? However you would want to label it. And so, I mean, one thing to say about that is that really suggests that it's not about how we say it, how charitably we engage in the discussion. It's not about how like rigorously we argue it with, citations and sources and footnotes and, quotations from experts. It really might be the very position that we hold that is objectionable, right? So it's not about the charity with which we express it or the the substantive rigor of the argument. It's about the conclusion that we reach. And like the basic conclusion of the book is that, to put it in a pithy phrase, biology isn't bigotry, and that our embodiment as male or female is something that's good. It should be cherished, celebrated, affirmed. And then it's a mistake to try to, quote, reassign bodies, right? Both it's a mistake at the physical level, you can't do it. You can't turn a man into a woman or a woman into a man. And it doesn't produce good outcomes, right? The type of happiness, wholeness, flourishing that people are looking for when they suffer from gender dysphoria isn't brought about with hormones and surgery. And for children, particularly not with puberty blocking drugs. My sense here is that it's that viewpoint, it's that substantive position, which is unacceptable. This is why Target refused to sell Abigail Strier's book. This is why, a variety of conservative Christian publications have been censored by social media when they run stories, news stories about these things. It's why I think Amazon has refused to sell my book. The add-on there is that they sold it for 3 years. The book came out in March of 2018. And it was, or maybe it was February of 2018, because then it was delisted at the end of February of 2021. And there are a couple of things that I think are, interesting about the timing, is that they removed it the weekend before the House of Representatives was set to vote on the Equality Act. I assume our audience knows the basics of the Equality Act, but a rough and ready description: it takes the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which bans discrimination on the basis of race. It adds sexual orientation and gender identity as protected classes. It then expands the number of institutions that will be regulated under the Civil Rights Act. And then it eliminates religious liberty protections from the Religious Freedom Restoration Act as applying to the Equality Act. So what it more or less says that if you believe we're created male and female, and that male and female are created for each other in marriage, you would now run afoul of the Civil Rights Act, and you wouldn't have RFRA as a defense. And there would be nothing for secular girls and women who care about privacy and safety and athletic fairness and good medicine, right? I was one of the more outspoken critics of that bill. And the weekend before the House is set to vote on the bill, the book gets disappeared, right? I mean, clearly this was, to my mind, the timing's not happenstance. It's an attempt to discredit someone, to marginalize someone, to kneecap someone, so that his public advocacy and commentary would be discredited, right? The other thing that's interesting here is that for 3 years, they sold the book when Donald Trump was president, when Bill Barr was attorney general, and when Senator Josh Hawley was in the majority and was on committees that would have oversight power, right? And so I think part of this is also about what can we get away with, and what can we do that might be strategically aligned with our political agenda. The publisher, we received no advance notice that they were removing the book, even though their own policies say that they will reach out to authors and publishers ahead of time to try to work out a resolution prior to removing books. And when they did eventually notify us, we went through the appeal process, and all they would say is that the book violates their content policy. And then what they said in a response to an inquiry from 4 senators was that it violates their contents policy because it, quote, frames LGBTQ identities as mental illnesses. And the book does neither of those things. It doesn't discuss LGBTQ identities as anything. It doesn't talk about the identities. It talks about an actual medical condition known as gender dysphoria. And then 2, it doesn't use the language of mental illness, precisely because I know people on the left view that phrase as kind of being a loaded and possibly stigmatizing phrase. So I don't use that phrase, and intentionally so, for the same reason that the analogy that the book uses is with anorexia. And none of us would describe a high school girl with anorexia as being mentally ill. But I also would hope that none of us would say that liposuction is the solution to anorexia, right? That's the needle that I was trying to thread with the book, is to say that, yes, gender dysphoria is a serious condition. I'm not going to describe it in ways that might be stigmatizing, but I also don't think that physical solutions are the proper response. So now it's been, I don't know, over 2 months and no further follow-up from Amazon. An independent bookseller, I believe it's called bookshop.org, which had kind of built itself as like the largest network of independent booksellers as a way of rivaling Amazon, has also removed the book. But you can get it, as far as I know, still at Barnes & Noble and directly through the publisher.
Well, thank you, Ryan, for sharing that. And I know it's been troubling to watch those developments and watch Amazon do that. Craig, I want you to share a little bit about what happened with Focus on the Family and I believe Citizen Magazine with Twitter and them sort of banning or blocking from Twitter. Maybe share your experience with that.
Yeah, and I don't have the exact words. I probably should have prepared better for the call, but I can talk precisely to the point here. Focus on the Family has a daily magazine called Daily Citizen, and a very large amount of people consume that information. Focus on the Family is a essential part of a lot of parents' lives. I know I had a strong-willed child. My wife and I read Dr. Dobson's book when she was about 4, and it helped us raise our oldest daughter. And I know that whether it's in the foster care system, adoption, divorce, alternatives to abortion and pregnancies, they're a life and death resource for families. Focus on the Family is. They're largely focused on programmatic offering, educational services and information. And people that are in crisis look to Focus on Family for that leadership. And what they did was they were commenting on the nominee of President Biden to serve in the Health and Human Services as a presidential nominee that would need Senate confirmation. And they referred to the person as a transgender woman, and they put a comma and said that is a man who is living their life as a woman. And then went on. It was literally it was a clarification, because as I say those words right now, and they get confused to me all the time, the left has tried to disregard truth by renaming language, right? It depends on what the definition of is. We're not sure. It depends on who you talk to accumulate power. And the leaders at Focus on the Family knew their audience wouldn't know what a transgender woman meant. Is that a man who is saying that they're a woman, or is that a woman saying that they're a man? So understand, they were not even offering a critique. They were helping their audience understand the language of the left as they invent different words. And that is what got their account frozen. They reached out through the process that they all say to the media, hey, we're here for you. We have a process. We have people to talk to you. And said clearly, there was nothing in this that took a shot at anybody. Our audience has no idea what you're talking about with the labels that you choose. What is this? And similar to the experience that Ryan had with his book, At Amazon, they did not really give any reason attributable to a policy. They were not able to have a cogent discussion on the point that was raised. You know, again, if you're in the LGBTQ community, I would imagine there's a lot of those sentences defining what their terms are available on their websites and their blogs and other things to make people aware as they make up new words of what they mean by that. But when it was said by a conservative Christian organization without a really firm footing on what that violated or any other reason, other than to say, you can't say that, focus on the family. Somebody else might have the right, but we're in charge of information in America right now. So your account is frozen unless you remove these things and something that they can't do because there wasn't a point raised that warranted a change. You know, that's another thing that's scary as we venture down this road talking about these things is it's so arbitrary and capricious what people are bringing up. They're saying literally give us control in the 1984 sense to do whatever we want, to define whatever we want, to make up whatever we want. You know, beyond just what Focus experienced, you have, I've read where they're trying to redefine foreign languages now that use gender as feminine or masculine and how you say different words. And who in America actually keeps up with that and has any idea what they're talking about and how disrespectful that is to these Spanish and French and Italian speaking countries and everything. So they're kind of off to the races with what they're inventing. They're not giving Christians or Americans an understanding, as Ryan pointed out, and for those that are listening, and maybe some that are listening are on the left and they don't understand this, that I'm a person in recovery for addiction. That gets described as a mental illness. It gets described as a disease. I don't believe either, because every time I went back to drinking, I was sober. So it's not a medical disease. You know, there's something else wrong with me, but I respect the conversation when people have a cogent one to say, how do we have the right words to talk about somebody who was called an addict or an alcoholic? And we can do that as a culture, but that's not the conversation we're having here. It's arbitrary, it's capricious, and it's being applied, as Ryan pointed out, in a manner that is deliberately aimed at stifling debate. And worse than that, information itself, so the public can make a decision on calling balls and strikes. The public didn't like pornography, in the public square. The Supreme Court had to make rulings on that and everything. They're trying to call balls and strikes before the public even gets to hear the content of Ryan's book, the content of what Focus on the Family is saying in Citizen Link and everything else. They're actually trying to silence our American voices and discourse. And when they talk about a threat to democracy, our founding fathers labeled that number one out of the 10 things that they thought were the biggest threats to our democracy. That was the First Amendment. And so it's a big deal. And I'll say one last thing on Focus on the Family and their daily citizen. You can find it on their website. Please do. They're still trying to find ways to make sure that information is available, and the tragedy that it's not, through over 1 million people that consumed it every day on Twitter. But that got the largest response in our history at the Family Policy Alliance of Engagement. Not only did our existing audience leave their seat, so to speak, and sign petitions and letters and everything and take action, but 50,000 new people came into the fold, over 50,000 people. And so I think that the social media giants for right now are literally playing with fire and not realizing, as I made the MySpace comment earlier, or we could joke about Ma Bell in the 80s, and all sorts of things like that of what they're playing with, because they're trying to silence, in my opinion, well past half of the American population. And it's becoming very clear to America what they're doing.
Thank you, Craig. And we're continuing to monitor, obviously, the situation with Citizen Magazine and Focus on the Family there with Twitter. Jason, I want to come back to you, because one of the things I think the expertise you bring is the engagement you've had with the platforms. And I know you've been highly critical of the way that the platforms have made these definitions in terms of what is hate speech, what is incitement. I think all of us, regardless of where you stand on some of the decisions the platforms have made, and obviously many of them have been egregious, like we've seen with Ryan and with Focus. I think we all understand that there's some level of content moderation that platforms have to do, right? There's egregious things, that fit certain definitions of incitement, or child pornography, or certain other things. But it does seem like the platforms and the decision making is kind of influenced in ways that are not helpful to conservatives. Talk about why these decisions kind of happen and what conservatives can do to influence these platforms to make better decisions if there's recourse there.
Yeah, I think it's helpful to have context in terms of especially Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. This is a law that's enacted in 1996 as the internet is kind of this fledgling medium. So with Section 230 gives a level of immunity for platforms to engage and encourages them. It doesn't require, but it highly encourages them to enact good faith content moderation. And in many ways, we're kind of the beneficiaries of that. Is Web 2.0, a lot of these social media platforms, these online bulletin boards. Before it was CompuServe and Prodigy and these online bulletin boards. Now it's Twitter, Facebook, Amazon, Google, etc. Is we benefit from a lot of these things. And so the original goal behind 230 was to encourage these platforms to pursue good faith content moderation. And exactly what good faith meant, obviously, if you read 230, it's a little convoluted. It's not exactly detailed there on exactly what this should look like, but it was encouraging this because at the time, as these platforms were rising in prominence and value in American society, these platforms can easily become havens of hate, of violence, of child pornography, of just vitriol and just gross nature where you would not want to be on these platforms. And one of the arguments that's often made is we want free speech all the time. We don't want any content moderation. And I think that's a pretty untenable position because without a level of content moderation, you would not feel comfortable, especially having your children. And now that they're talking about Instagram for 13 and up, having like Instagram for kids, we would not want our children, much less have ourselves on these platforms without any level of content moderation. And so the companies set various standards or community standards, public policy, content moderation policies, and they did so with the hope of doing some good faith. And so I do believe that they and some have a good intent behind a lot of this original policy creation. But often these policies were driven by large groups, especially I've heard from multiple social media companies that the political left is extremely organized, especially in terms of tech policy. And as these decisions and as these policies were being formed, is the political left had a very large seat at the table. It's very influential. Where these companies have said to me is saying the political right, the more conservative movements was very fragmented. There weren't a lot of people invested in these conversations, which is one of the reasons I'm very thankful for NRB, thankful for EPPC and Family Policy Alliance for stepping into these conversations as conservatives, because there's a lack of substantive engagement from the political right, from conservatives, and especially people of faith in a lot of these conversations to help shape these policies. And that's what I've been doing for the last few years is when a new policy is coming up to say, hey, they want to get our perspective on it. So I have a seat at the table to say, this is where I think this policy is ill-defined. I think it's going to be misappropriated or misapplied. But in terms of content moderation, often when we think that there may be people sitting in Silicon Valley or kind of up the West Coast that sit and wait for a conservative to tweet or post or do something that can violate one of these policies to go take it down. But often these things are done through automated processes. I've written a lot about artificial intelligence and the use of algorithms. They take these policies, they apply because there's millions and millions of pieces of content that's being removed from these platforms that we want removed from these platforms, by the way. Dangerous speech, pornography, child pornography, sex trafficking, all sorts of really dehumanizing aspects. And sometimes these policies are so broadly defined, or the algorithm makes a mistake or takes something down that it shouldn't. So you have that appeal process. and then you have a human reviewer, and often that human reviewer still has thousands of pieces of content that they have to review per day. So even in our own organization, we had this happen last year with a video on coronavirus and COVID vaccines, where the video was removed. We appealed. We actually lost that appeal to the human reviewer, and then made a subsequent appeal to actually have the video restored. And part of that process was the person saying to us that the moderator has thousands of pieces of content before them, so they're not actually watching or reading or being able to dig into the details or the context behind a lot of these posts. Now, granted, that was a good scenario, but then we have these dangerous or more kind of suppression of free speech and free expression scenarios that we're seeing with Focus on the Family or Ryan's book, or a plethora of other issues. And so I think one of the things when we get into these conversations is talking about the complexity and the nuance here, is that content moderation is good. We want content moderation. These make our online places more enjoyable, where we can get the information we need, but we also have to balance that with an ideological policy position that labels certain types of religious speech or certain types of ideologies as inherently bigoted or inherently hateful. And that's what you're seeing in a lot of these policies, especially surrounding hate speech. And I think it's a really interesting thing to note that most of these issues that we're seeing in terms of censorship or banning on these platforms often have to do with transgenderism. In the case of Focus on the Family, that was the mislabeling or misgendering or dead naming. Dr. Rachel Levine from HSS, you see that with Ryan's book, which, by the way, I will give a plug to Ryan's book. It's a very charitable book. It's actually very, very nuanced. And that's one of the surprising things that I think if someone at Amazon actually sat down and read the book, they would have realized that this in no way, shape, or form violates that policy, however ill-defined it is. But I think it's important for conservatives to, one, rally together to realize there's a diversity of opinion within our own movement on how to engage these conversations, but seek to have a seat at the table in the sense of speaking to these issues with clarity, with nuance, with charitability, and also understanding the gravity and the nature of these things. These didn't just happen in a vacuum. It didn't just happen in the last 2 or 3 or 4 months. It didn't just happen in the last 2 or 3 or 4 years. These are ongoing conversations that have been going on for well over 20 years about the nature of content moderation, the nature of hate speech. And often, I'll say this as I end, is often a lot of these policies, specifically around hate speech, which is kind of the presenting issue in a lot of these cases, is more informed by standards set by the Southern Poverty Law Center and its definition of hate speech and hateful conduct and hate organizations, rather than a more nuanced, charitable understanding of people of faith and religious and conservative organizations. And so I think what we can do is present an alternative. And that's what we hope to do, our organization, through the ERLC and this new project that we're going to announce here in a few weeks, is stepping into these conversations, providing the resource and providing the thought behind how to craft better policies that better reflect American values as a whole, not as a very specific segment of the American population, but larger things that we can all agree upon. And then also having a little bit of a thicker skin. I think often this isn't just for the right or the left, but saying, like, when you see something online that you don't like, you have tools that you don't have to report this as hate speech and say this should be deplatformed. You can keep scrolling, you can mute, you can block. You have a lot of tools at your disposal to curate your feeds in ways that are better suiting for you. But I think we can all agree on there's certain levels of content moderation that are good, but obviously these are kind of crossing that threshold into very dangerous territory. So not only do we need some type of governmental response, which there's numerous arguments on the best way to go about that and disagreements on that, but we also need policy engagement from these organizations, from organizations like EPPC and ERLC and Family Policy Alliance, to step in to help craft better solutions. Because I found that a lot of these companies are actually much more open to conversation than often we think, because instead of lobbing bombs on social media, is sitting down across a table with a cup of coffee or a Zoom meeting in the middle of a pandemic to talk about these policies with these teams, you actually get a lot further than you do just lobbing bombs on social media. And so I think we can take a charitable, grace-filled response and realize that we can use these tools in very humanizing and ways that are for the public good, for the common good, but also know that these things they can be very dangerous. And I think the platforms are trying in some sense, not always successfully, to manage these online behemoths that they've created and create a safe and workable and healthy environment for all involved.
So it does sound like, and one of the things I'm thinking as all of you are talking, and at NRB, we're concerned about this because our ministries are platform dependent. You think of churches, you think of, media ministries, TV, radio, digital, they're platform dependent, YouTube, Facebook, Vimeo, and then you go back even to like service providers. So this is an issue of concern. And if the community standards are set by places like the Southern Poverty Law Center, as Jason said, we're in a lot of trouble. So it does sound like we almost need to treat these platforms as almost like mini governments, where we need to lobby them and put pressure on them, as the left has been doing. I want to open it up a little bit to anybody who wants to answer, but I know there's been a number of reform proposals to kind of rein in the power of big tech. You heard Clarence Thomas kind of opine on a little bit on perhaps treating them like utilities, and I know there's pros and cons with that. There's also some Section 230 reform proposals out there that offer some mild reforms, maybe pressing the platforms to have greater transparency when they do make a decision, have a policy of viewpoint neutrality. NRB put out a white paper in the last couple of years, just urging the platforms to adhere to kind of standards set by the Supreme Court in terms of what is indecency, what is incitement, and those kind of hew to those standards instead of other standards. So I'm just curious, I want to open this up to the panel to say, what are our thoughts on some of the reform proposals, and then obviously in addition to those, there's been, some conversation about trust busting and sort of, breaking up the monopolies. And so how should we as conservatives be thinking about these? I know there's a diversity of opinion, but I'd love to kind of throw that out there in ways that, obviously, as Ryan said, we're not, just completely, hands off, but on the other hand, we don't want government saying what platforms should and shouldn't post. But I'd love to hear your perspective on those things.
I got a couple ideas. I'll jump in first from that perspective that I said, as somebody who, as a speaker of the House, you see all sorts of regulation, the energy industry, the telecom, also liquor, strip clubs, all that comes under state regulation. And whether you like it or not, you get to learn about regulation and what it does. And I think the biggest thing that the big tech, the biggies, Twitter, Facebook, and Amazon are trading right now is on their dominance in their market. And what keeps them dominant, and when you look to say we're going to break them up, what kept our cell phone bills over $100 a month was we couldn't change our phone number from one cell phone company to another. So as soon as the government said, you're going to be able to take your phone number with you wherever you went, every other commercial on TV is fighting to give you away free phones, and they keep cutting their rates down, where I think it's about $30 or $35 now with a free iPhone. And it's because of the portability of your phone number. And that's a reform we could look at, is to say, you have to have the portability of everything I've done on Facebook for the last 15 years. If I decide to go to a different platform, all my pictures of my cats and dogs and family events get transferred over to whatever platform I choose. And that would send a shockwave, through them, where they would actually have to fight to keep their customers by serving them better. And the other point that I want to make is back to, as we pointed out, reading these things. And, people at home, that are watching this, they expect us, to give you, the feedback. And 230 itself, if you read 230, and a lot of folks listening here to this broadcast will say, Donald Trump said, get rid of it. Now I've heard, well, that means that porn is everywhere. And it doesn't come just from the bad guys. It could come from people I went to high school with, putting it on their Facebook feeds and YouTube and stuff. And we want something there. If you read 230, the intent was for the user to be in control of the moderation. And that is what got lost. When Google and the others said, we can't afford to charge people $1, we'll lose our customers to use our service. We're going to make them the product, and we're going to advertise off of them. They're what we're selling because it's free. Now we don't care about their moderation anymore. We're going to give them whoever pays us the most or gives us the most influence to present stuff to them. And so it is a structural issue where we could go back to 230 and say, hey, Congress actually said the user is supposed to be able to turn this stuff on and off. And by the way, it doesn't even stop with them. Let's add in another one, Netflix, to say, I'll use Caddyshack just to make my point. I grew up watching Caddyshack on the reruns in a way that was acceptable for me at that age to watch Caddyshack, the movie with Bill Murray, right? I didn't even know how many swear words were in that movie until I became an adult and I watched it somewhere else, because the media companies at the time allowed the users to moderate for the different venues and the platforms they had. That seems to me that's been abandoned. I can't say on Netflix, I want you to cut out certain parts of a movie I want to watch. I can't say to Facebook and others, like, I don't want liberal or conservative speech, or I don't want this religion or that religion or whatever. And that's what 230 was supposed to do. And it was supposed to empower the user. And I think big tech might be open to empowering the users. They say that's what they're all about. But I'm just saying that the structure right now, structurally, it's imbalance where it's not really. It's they want to present for their advertisers, the users, and they want to be in charge of how that gets presented, because that's actually how they make their money. So we got to have a structural conversation when we talk about reform.
That's really good. Any other thoughts on some of the proposals across the board? I don't know, Ryan, I know you've talked a little bit from a theoretical level about some of these, but
Sure, yeah.
Anything that intrigues you on ways to solve this issue?
Yeah, I mean, two big thoughts there. One is that, my policy expertise is not in big tech. It's, I've written a lot about marriage, family, religious liberty, gender identity, bioethics, and then political philosophy. But so I don't want to pretend to be an expert on big tech public policy in particular. But we have hired someone who is. So at EDPC, maybe a month or so ago, we launched a big tech project. Claire Morell, who had been in the Department of Justice as an assistant to Attorney General Bill Barr on the big tech stuff. She's heading it up for us. And sometime this summer, we're going to be hosting a conference with a mixture of law professors, elected officials, and policy wonks to go through different aspects. And I think one panel is going to be on Section 230 reform, one panel is going to be on antitrust, and then one panel is going to be on public accommodation and common carrier public utility approaches. And to my mind, and so the second part is that I see some of the challenges we face with big tech right now as not fitting perfectly any of the historical models that we've used to regulate business, because the big tech is a different type of business. And that means we probably need to create a new model. But I mean, some of the models to think about, and then I think big tech kind of lies at the intersection of these, is we have antitrust and anti-monopoly law, because scale matters, size and scope matters. And there's a difference between a mom and pop bookstore that won't sell a book and Amazon when it won't sell a book. The mom and pop bookstore, that won't even register on your sales report, and it won't register to a publisher thinking about selling a book. But if Amazon refuses to sell a book, publishers and authors are going to think twice before writing a book that Amazon might refuse to sell, right? So antitrust monopoly law matters, and it might fit for some of these cases because size matters. Second, I do think public accommodation law might be relevant for some of these areas. For example, in Seattle, where Amazon is headquartered, political ideology is a protected class. And so there's a question here whether or not Amazon is discriminating against certain authors based upon their political ideology. And the argument that Amazon made in an amicus brief when it filed against Barronelle Stutzman, the florist, the logic of that argument would cut against Amazon in this case, right? And so there's a way of thinking about public accommodation and anti-discrimination law. Right? Jason had mentioned that Section 230 allows good faith content moderation. I question some of that good faith. I question whether or not it's a pretext for viewpoint discrimination. And discriminating based on a viewpoint is therefore a proxy for discriminating against the identity, according to the legal theories on the left, right? So there's that one. So public accommodation law would be the second, the first being antitrust monopoly. There's also the common carrier framework here, where you would have, like, imagine if the electric company or the water company said, we won't serve you because you're religious or because you're conservative, right? We're going to shut off your power. We only serve our secular, our liberal clients, right? I mean, there's a reason why common carriers have to carry everyone. And then, how does that apply to big tech? It's not a simple one-to-one map on. And then the fourth area would be something like limited public forums. And limited public forums typically are government fora that are then opened up to the public. So it's kind of like a public school building that on the weekends is open to be rented out. And the argument is that, well, if you rent it out on Saturday to like the basketball league in the gymnasium, you can't then exclude a church from renting it out on Sunday to host a worship service. If I remember correctly, Thomas mentions the Marsh case, which involved like a company town and their mall. And so technically it's a private mall, but they were saying that in this context, that mall actually kind of served as a limited public forum. And so being able to speak, in like kind of like the hallways of the mall would be a form of protected speech. It strikes me that some of the big tech cases are at the intersection of, we care about the size and the scope, the anti-monopoly part, we care about the anti-discrimination part. Like, imagine just what your reaction would be if Amazon said, we don't sell books by authors of a certain race or of a certain religion, right? We would see the concern there. The common carrier, public utility part, and then the limited public forum, especially I think for social media, much more limited public forum and common carrier, but none of them fit perfectly, right? These are all kind of analogies. We're reasoning analogically. It's not a univocal form of predication, but it's also not an equivocal form either, right? It's analogical. And I do think that's where we'll need to think maybe what's the fifth? If those are four different historic, legal, regulatory frameworks, what would be a fifth framework for policymakers to develop that would meet the challenge of today, right? And it may be 230 reform, it may be common carrier, it may be antitrust, but it may not be, right? I haven't yet prejudged, what the outcome should be, just because I haven't had the time, the bandwidth to really think it through myself.
That's good. Jason, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think Ryan kind of explains a lot of the main options there. To encourage listeners to check out Justice Thomas's concurrence, which a few weeks ago, the case was originally Trump versus the Knight First Amendment Institute at Columbia University. It was changed when President Trump left office in January, and it became Biden versus. So it's a little confusing when you start to read it, like what's actually going on here? Which president are we talking about? But it's a very good concurrence because Justice Thomas kind of serves up this common carrier language. He serves up this public accommodation, public utility argument, and then proceeds to shred both of them. So he basically puts them up and says, these are options that we have. And then we go through, and he goes through the pros and the cons of it. And I think Ryan's exactly right in his saying, none of these are going to fit exactly perfectly. So I have some major issues, especially around common carrier language, because I think sometimes that analogy, when it's placed on big tech, misunderstands what the social media companies are, the platforms that they provided. It's not just a conduit of information, but often this information is curated, it's personalized. Just because we tweet something today doesn't mean, and all four of us follow each other, doesn't mean that we're all four going to see it. You have kind of curated, that's the nature of the algorithms or the artificial intelligence that's helping to drive and curate those platforms. And so there's a lot of nuance in that. You have arguments around 230 about reforming it, repealing it. It's very interesting kind of in this moment in American history is we have a rare bipartisan agreement that something is not right here. On the left and the right is an acknowledgement that we have an outsized influence of the technology industry in general. And I don't say big tech specifically because sometimes big tech, actually that moniker leaves out some of the actual big tech companies in terms of Microsoft and their market share. So I prefer not to use that term and more talk about the the technology industry in general, but we have an industry that's very unique in terms of the historical, the place in society, the level of control over public discourse and the conversations that we have as a nation. And I think there's a lot of different options here. I think coming from a conservative perspective, my gut or my initial reaction is that I don't want the government to come in and immediately regulate this industry in terms of breaking it up or blowing up these policies or applying these kind of large statutes. And the reason is because I don't want the government to have that level of authority in private matters, but also understanding these are not just private matters. These have public influence. They have kind of influence on, as Ryan said, is Amazon going to, if Amazon's not going to sell this book or will delist it at some point, maybe a publisher doesn't publish it or a writer doesn't write it. And so I think as Christians, when we step into these conversations, whether we're on more of the political left or the political right, is we step in and say, something's not right here. And we need to have a robust dialogue, public discourse and debates over these issues, and not do that through these platforms in many ways, because this is a soundbite culture. We have these quotes, things that go viral, the engagement. You have the left saying that we should have more content moderation, saying that we need to reform 230 because 230 is not taking, it doesn't have a bad Samaritan clause. If you're familiar with 230s, they're good Samaritan, good faith moderation, but they said we should have bad faith. In terms of we should come in here and have even more, because we have violent incitement happening on these platforms. You have a person who can live stream a mass shooting on Facebook, and the platform is trying to take it down, and it keeps getting reposted and shared all around the world, as we saw in Christchurch a few years ago. And so in many ways, like you see the left saying we should have more moderation, the right is often saying we should have less. And often we're just not coming to the table and having robust dialogue and conversation. So that's why I'm encouraged, one, by NRB having a conversation like this, but also our respective organizations stepping into these conversations. And often I think within our movement in general, we think that disagreement over common carrier regulation or a public utility or Section 230 reform automatically means you're not of us anymore. And I think we need to kind of shred that and let that go, is to say, no, we can have an inter-movement conversation about the best way and the best way to move forward here. But I think specifically for the church and specifically for these ministries is understanding that we're kind of in some ways in uncharted territory. These are new questions. Even Justice Thomas was saying in his concurrence that you can't just apply old doctrine to new situations. You have to think through this. And this is an ongoing conversation. But what it does reveal is the massive influence and power and influence of technology in general on our lives, how it's radically altered. So technology isn't an issue that's a separate issue for many of our organizations. It's an issue that undergirds issues of marriage and family, of parenting, of religious speech, of connecting, of justice issues, of human dignity issues. Technology undergirds so much of our society. It reminds me of one of the most influential thinkers of my life, a gentleman named Jacques Ellul, who wrote in the 50s and 60s, who spoke of the technological society. And often there's another Canadian philosopher, George Grant, who would talk about, we often think we need more technology to solve the problems that technology came about in the first place. And I think a lot of these older figures in technology saw more clearly the issues we're having today. And it would behoove us to go back and maybe even read some of these older figures in technology to understand the way that our lives and our society has been shaped by technology. And so that way we have a little bit more of open eyes and kind of clear minds as we step into a lot of these conversations. Because I do think there's a way forward. It's a narrow path. It's not there's not going to be a ton of agreement on these things. But I do think it's helpful for us to have these charitable conversations, to seek to have nuance and understand the complexity of the issues at stake, and also to rally together and to say, look, we can come up with common sense reform or common sense regulation here with those who may not share our exact ideological preference, because we can step into these things saying they're influential, they do shape our society, and we need to be invested in. This is an opportunity, I think, for the church to have a platform to be able to speak to a lot of the nuance and challenges that are before us with charitably, with grace, and ultimately wanting to see a greater and stronger public discourse.
Well, this is a good word, and unfortunately, our time is up. But I'm so grateful for all of my guests. Craig DeRoche, who's the president and CEO of the Family Policy Council, a very important organization doing incredible work in our states on important issues to Christian conservatives. Jason Thacker, who is the chair of research and technology ethics at ERLC, really a leading voice on all these issues, author of the book, The Age of AI. And of course, Ryan Anderson, the president of the Ethics and Public Policy Center and author of When Harry Became Sally. By the way, we put a link to the book. So if y'all want to, it's right there in the chat. And grateful for Ryan and his organization hosting these conversations as well. This is important. Obviously, I think this is going to be an ongoing discussion going forward for a long time. I want to encourage everyone, if you're still on here, to join us in Texas, June 21st through the 25th for the NRB convention. You can go to nrbconvention.org. We're going to have conversations very much like this there. Jason will be one of our guests along with several others, experts on this issue. But for now, we're signing off, and thank you for joining us today for NRB Live at Lunch.